requirements and vaccination. Sorry for that. Largely because it would take way more than an hour, I think, to have that corridor. We're also really aware that there is a lot of information out there available about the changes. So we're not going to be doing a presentation about all the changes around legislation and requirements. I'm assuming that many, if not all of you, have already done a lot of reading. Having said that, Community Waikato held a hui on Monday with a lawyer who went through all the changes, and they've kindly agreed to make available the recording of that hui. So we'll make that available if that would be of interest to you. Also, Neighbourhood Support have very kindly agreed to let us share their risk assessment tool that they've developed based on Worksafe guidelines, if that's of any interest to you. Obviously, that's in lieu of what the government will be presenting at some point. So on the whole, these forums have been about managers sharing their experiences so we can learn from each other. However, we are expecting quite a number of people on the Zoom, so we're aware that we're not going to be able to have everyone share that information, hence we asked for questions, and we have received quite a few, so we'll go through those questions, and then I encourage you to put into chat any other questions that you have. I'm guessing the questions that are asked will stimulate other questions. I'll say right now, I'm not a lawyer, but I have been spotting up and attending a number of webinars about this, and we're in the process of developing 2 documents. One is for organisations that are under the mandate, and one document for those organisations that aren't under the mandate. And we're trying to synthesise all the information that's become available, and we hope to have that available next week. And obviously we'll keep that updated because the landscape's changing so quickly. Kathy, have we got Lucy on?
No, I don't know where she is. Well, she's not on.
Okay.
I'm here.
Oh, she is here.
Lucy.
Where are you? Whose name are you under?
Meeting at st.co.nz.
Oh, there you are.
Yeah, sorry, I was about 3 minutes late. We had some technical difficulties trying to launch the Zoom, but I'm here.
Oh,
Great.
Welcome, Lucy. So we're really very, very grateful to have Lucy Nolan from Sharp Tudhope, who's joining us to be able to respond to any questions of a more of a legal nature. Having said that, please note that this doesn't constitute legal advice, and for that you would obviously need to go and talk to a lawyer. Because we have a fairly large number of people on the SUI, unfortunately, we're not going to have time to go around and ask all of you to introduce yourselves, otherwise that would probably take up half the hui. So I think we'll get on to the questions we've received so far. And as I said, please put into the chat any other questions you have. And I just wondered, just in all the reading I've done, and Lucy, please do advise if I have this wrong, but if I were to put it in a nutshell, what I'm understanding is if you are under the mandate and have staff who choose not to be vaccinated or not reveal their status, the key thing is about consulting, acting in good faith, and trying to find ways that they can still remain employed, for example, through redeployment or other mitigation measures. And if you're not under the mandate, it's about undertaking a risk assessment of every role that you have in your organisation. And where you have staff who choose not to be vaccinated or do not reveal their vax status, and you've deemed that role requires vaccination, then you need to consult with them, act in good faith, and look at those mitigation measures, such as working from home remotely. So if I were to say that in a nutshell, that's how I understand it. But Lucy, you may have, I don't know if you've got any other comments to give.
Yeah, so one thing that's confusing a lot of people is the use of this term mandate. So we've got kind of 2 separate, or 2 or more categories that people are kind of using this term in. So we first have the vaccination order. So they're your healthcare workers, your teachers, border workers who have actually been mandated by legislation that they must be vaccinated. Then we have the separate category that's popping up at the moment, because of the incoming COVID protection framework or the traffic light system, and this talk about people who will be in businesses that require vaccine certificates to be vaccinated, and then mandates kind of used in that way as well. But if we look at the protection framework, which you can download offline, the nice colourful traffic light, the outline of the traffic light system, even if you're in businesses like hospitality and events and gatherings, you still have the choice as to whether or not to implement vaccine certificates. But if you choose not to, you're going to be heavily restricted at the stricter levels at orange and red. So, and there are still some restrictions at green as well. So if the business chooses to use vaccine certificates, then those staff at those businesses will be mandated to be vaccinated, so that aligns with, you know, everyone else coming onto the premises. But if they choose not to use vaccine certificates, then those employees won't have to be vaccinated. So it's really about how the business chooses to operate once we move into that framework, and that's a separate category to people who are actually mandated under legislation, under the order. You must be vaccinated to do this role, otherwise find another job. So just to kind of clarify that, because I know there's a lot of confusion about this use of the word mandate and what does it mean. And then, yeah, if you're not covered by a mandate, either under the COVID protection framework or under legislation, then employers would have to conduct a health and safety assessment, as you alluded to, Liz, and there's guidance about that on the Worksafe website. It's not entirely comprehensive. We're hoping to get an assessment tool soon. A vaccination legislation bill has passed its third reading in Parliament and is expected to get the Royal Assent later today, that provides for an assessment tool to be developed. It hasn't been developed yet, it's just the impetus for that to be developed. So hopefully that'll come out and give people a bit more clarity, but it's very much a dynamic situation at the moment.
That answers Julian's questions around risk assessment. I mentioned earlier, Julian, you might not have been here, we're going to make available a risk assessment tool that's based on the Worksafe information that Lucy alluded to. There is some subjectivity to it, I agree. And some people have also suggested, because managers aren't necessarily experienced in undertaking risk assessments, you may want to get a health and safety professional in to assist you around that. We'll kick off with the questions we've received so far. Tessa's just asked, how does this work with volunteers and contractors? My understanding, and Lucy, is that volunteers are potentially treated the same as paid employees, and contractors are included in that need to be considered as part of a risk assessment. Is that correct, Lucy?
Yeah, so volunteers are included under the legislation mandates. So if you're in the healthcare, the border workers, the education, all of those sectors, volunteers are expressly included as having to be vaccinated. And I'm not entirely sure if anything express has come out in terms of the vaccine certificates, but I would imagine they would be included as well, because it's not about their status so much as it is about them just being in the premises and the risk that poses. So yes, that they would form part of the risk assessment, and you could require them to, if they want to fulfill that role, to be vaccinated, because it's about the health and safety issues more than their status, as whether they're an employee, a volunteer, or a contractor.
Okay, I see questions are starting to come through. I think maybe I'll first go to the ones we've received so far. So I'll read the question, and then I'll leave it for Lucy to respond. The first question: I'm a volunteer at St. Peter's Church and oversee 2 activities. Community lunch each Tuesday where we feed 35 to 50 people, and the other is social outreach where we counsel people and provide courses. I'm interested in learning more about effects on these activities and how others might be dealing with similar situations. Lucy, do you?
So that would come under this new COVID protection framework, and I encourage everyone to download it. It's quite a helpful tool, the one with all the colours on it. There are some gaps and questions, but it is quite clear around things for gatherings. So places of worship are expressly mentioned as falling under gatherings, and when we move to the COVID protection framework on the 3rd of December, that will be where the church has to make a choice as to whether they're going to use vaccine certificates or not. And if they use them, there will be no limits at green on how many people can be present at those kind of gatherings. If you don't use vaccine certificates, then you'll only be allowed to have 100 people at those gatherings when we're in green. When we're in orange, no limits on how many people if you use vaccines and vaccine certificates, and if you don't use them, 50 people limit. And it read up to 100 people if vaccine certificates and 10 people if not. So it's really about that choice, whether you're going to use vaccine certificates or not, as to how the framework will impact those activities. But they should be able to proceed in some way, shape or form, limits or otherwise.
Thank you. This is perhaps a little bit related to it. I'm just looking at the questions coming up from Jackie Knight. People are booking a meeting room for a private meeting. Is that considered a gathering or event?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
If people are booking a meeting room for a private meeting, is that considered a gathering or event?
There's not a heck of a lot of guidance on that at the moment, but when you look at the examples for events, they're much kind of bigger things, like they say markets, concerts, festivals come under events, and conferences and things like that for indoor events. It could possibly be a gathering depending on how many people were present. I think probably we'll find a lot of things are poured into that gathering category just from, drawing on experiences to date and, going through the lockdown levels and people meeting between households were sort of termed gatherings. So I imagine that there will be a lot of things will be poured into that, but at this stage there's not clear guidance as to meetings and things like that. The fact that you can, if there aren't that many people attending the meeting, the fact that you can socially distance in meeting rooms and wear face coverings and things, imagine will help those sorts of things proceed. But at this stage there's no absolute clear guidance on that.
Thank you, Lucy. A related question, and I think you've answered it, unless you want to say anything more. So if you're running an education course or youth group, etc., at a church, that is a gathering?
Yes, absolutely. Places of worship and marae and weddings, all those things are gatherings. So if you've got kind of an education event where there's a fair number of people, that would be a gathering.
Okay, thank you, Lucy. Going back to questions we've received earlier, this is from Alzheimer's. As a support and information provider, we are unclear whether we can ask for or restrict some of our group-based activities to those with vaccines. There's a bit more. We have an obligation to make our services as safe as possible. We also have an obligation not to deny people access to basic health and disability services. Shall I just keep on reading all of it, Lucy?
I do have it in front of me, but if it's for the benefit of the group, then
yes, I'll do it for the group, so I'll keep on reading. Most likely, some of the venues we use will require vaccination passports, so a decision will be made for us in some instances. It would be ideal for us to be consistent across all groups. Would we be within our rights to make certain group-based services only available to vaccinated people and offer unvaccinated the option of virtual, example, Zoom-based alternatives?
Yeah, so the things that this kind of throws up for me is that there is this overarching duty to keep everyone safe, and because you're dealing with quite vulnerable members of society, the risk there of transmission and the effect on those people is a bit more elevated when you compare it to the general populace. So that's kind of the first consideration. The second is that staff and volunteers also, there's a duty to keep them safe. And if they're not comfortable kind of meeting and being involved with a number of people who are unvaccinated, then the organisation needs to support that. So Zoom-based alternatives are quite a good option for unvaccinated people. Another thing to consider is that because Alzheimer's patients may not have capacity to consent to the vaccination, there may be an issue that there are a higher incidence of people, you know, in the absence of an enduring power of attorney or something like that, who cannot be vaccinated because they can't consent. And there is that consideration of, you know, of making sure everyone else is kept safe, and particularly other vulnerable elderly people. So if there are more people kind of unvaccinated, then ideally trying to keep everyone safe, Zoom is quite a good alternative because you're not completely denying them services. And I'm aware of GPs and things like that who are even insisting on unvaccinated people do not enter their premises. They're to be seen in the car park or by phone consult. So that is kind of, as far as I'm aware, standardised already within sort of the healthcare system. So.
Thank you. There's some more questions, sorry, from our Alzheimer's, and Ben, feel free to jump in. I just thought I'd read them out. We also provide a volunteer one-to-one companionship-based visitor service. Some of our volunteers may only want to do this if they know the household is vaccinated. Can we ask status?
Yeah, so the short answer to that is you can ask anyone what their status is. They don't have to answer you, but in the context of providing the service and, you know, trying to make sure everyone's kept safe, you can say, look, you don't have to answer, but if you don't answer, we have to assume that you're not vaccinated for health and safety reasons. Of course, the Privacy Act would apply to any information that you gather that way. So that means that the organisation has to collect only the minimum amount of information necessary, so just their status and kind of not much else. And they have to take reasonable steps to make sure that the person from whom they're collecting the information knows the purpose for that collection of the information, and that they have a right to correct that information. And that may not be so much of an issue if it's a one-off instance, but if it was an ongoing thing where they were coming back for various services and you were keeping that information on file, then they would have a right to correct it. Of course, if they're storing it because these people are coming back or anything like that, then you have to store it in a secure way to make sure that it doesn't fall into the wrong hands.
Great, Lucy. And I think you've answered the next question, a more overarching question. Can we ask status of all clients? So I think you've covered that. And finally, if we do ask status, are we required to be robust about viewing vaccine passport proof?
So in terms of viewing the proof, that probably falls more into whether you're going to use vaccine certificates as part of the new traffic light system. If you are hosting gatherings, then you've got to make that choice as to whether you're going to use vaccine certificates or not. And if you choose to use vaccine certificates, then you will be required to police that. I believe there are infringement fines for refusing to police it. One would think that there would be a level of practicality to how those fines are handed out, because, you know, some sympathy surely has to go out for these people on the front lines having to deal with the general public who are not always entirely cooperative. But there was talk of the infringement fines increasing, but it doesn't look like they have been under the bill. So it appears that they're $300 or a court fine of $1,000 for refusing to enforce.
Okay, thank you. Another question from Jackie Knight. One of the things that has come up in conversations here is, what if you have an event that is requiring a vaccine pass to attend, and someone who is not vaccinated but does have a negative COVID test wants to attend?
Yeah, so under the current guidance that we have for the COVID protection framework, it doesn't make any provision for testing. The bill that we expect to receive Royal Assent today does contemplate the Minister making orders around testing and that potentially being kind of, someone's alternative to a vaccine certificate. But at this stage, what we have is there's no ability to use testing in place of vaccine certificates. So there may be more coming in that space, but for now, if there's no vaccine certificate, there's no entry to events.
Thank you for that. I'm wanting to know if employers can sack their staff for not being vaccinated if there is not a government requirement to do so.
Yeah, so that comes back to health and safety assessment, which is your absolute first port of call. And the health and safety assessment has to be about the role that the person's occupying. So, and that health and safety assessment has to be done for every single role within the organisation. It can't just be a blanket, we're going to do this for everyone as a general high-level health and safety risk assessment. You've got to look at every single role and go through all the criteria, which, we've got some guidance at the moment from Worksafe, hopefully getting more in the coming weeks. And then as part of that health and safety assessment, you need to consult with your staff. You need to consider whether there are alternative measures you can put in place, like PPE, social distancing, hygiene measures, all of those things. And you have to exhaust all other options before you say, right, this role has to be completed by a vaccinated person. And then if and when you come to that decision, you then have to follow a full and proper employment process before you make any decision to terminate. So that includes inviting the person to the meeting, having a meeting about your concerns, having a discussion, exploring any alternative duties that they could carry out in a role that didn't need to be vaccinated, and then and only then can you make a decision to terminate. Otherwise, the decision will absolutely be open to scrutiny and there will be exposure to personal grievances. And if anyone was thinking of terminating an employee's employment following a risk assessment, we'd suggest seeking legal advice before embarking on the termination process, just to make sure that everything's dotted and I's are crossed. The situation's a bit easier when it's future employees, because you obviously don't already have those duties to consult and things like that you do with existing employees. So I think we'll find that going forward, a lot of employers will make it a condition of employment before they'll even employ someone. And that's going to be easier to enforce than actually terminating someone's employment.
Just on that, Lucy, it's related to another question. An employer would have to determine that the role requires vaccination in order to require someone applying for that job to be vaccinated, if they're not under the mandate.
Yeah, it would be best practice to do a health and safety assessment before determining that all future employees in that particular role needed to be vaccinated, but it won't be subject to the same scrutiny as actually terminating someone's employment. It'll be interesting to see what develops in this space as more and more people lose their employment for not being vaccinated, because I think these people will find it potentially quite difficult to secure new roles if employers are going to make this a condition of employment going forward. So it may be that kind of making that decision not to employ people becomes a bit more scrutinised in the future if opportunities aren't there for people, but we'll just have to see what comes in that space.
Thanks, Lucy. I think you've already covered this. The last question we've received was, and then we'll go on to chat for other questions we haven't answered yet. Can we legally ask clients to disclose their vaccination status?
Yeah, and again, it just comes down to how you deal with the information. Make sure they know up front that they don't have to answer, but that you'll have to assume they're not if they don't, and making sure you keep that information and in accordance with the Privacy Act and destroy it when you no longer need it.
Thanks, Lucy. So just going back to chat, Janet Baird from Grief Support Services, if we are under the public order but have a position that is not face-to-face with clients, can non-vaccinated people hold that position?
If they're not interfacing with the general public.
That is not face-to-face with clients, that's right.
Yeah, so again, it would come down to a health and safety risk assessment, and I can't say now without looking at all of the factors in the organisation whether or not they can. That's very much a tailored process for each role, and if that particular participant wanted further information on that, then we'd suggest they either consult legal advice or a health and safety expert who would be able to help them further with that assessment.
From Tracy Christian, if we are using the vaccine pass, does that mean our client who is 12 years old has to provide a pass?
12 years old. So is it 12 and over or over 12 who can receive vaccines? It would depend on whether they're eligible for a vaccine yet. So if they, I believe 12-year-olds can be vaccinated. If they can be vaccinated, then they would be treated just as everyone else who has to be vaccinated. If they can't be vaccinated because they're below the age of eligibility, then of course they wouldn't have to.
Okay, thank you. So going back to some more questions, is there a timeline for the current traffic light framework? Safe is still a subjective term when the vaccine does not fully protect the participant. Large gatherings of vaccinated people still carry a risk of spread of COVID.
Sorry, what's the question?
Is there a timeline for the current traffic light framework?
That's not clear. The government hasn't been clear on that. They've said it won't be in place forever, but they haven't given an end date for it yet.
Glenn from Alzheimer's, is there some guidance or definition of close contact business? Certainly seems like hairdressers, but where can we look to get information to assess whether or not our activities would fit into this?
That's a good question. I am not sure if there's actually a legislative decision or not, but if you kind of think about how the business operates, from a practical point of view, it's most likely to be businesses where you cannot distance. So, your physios, your beauticians, your hairdressers, anything that's providing a service where you actually cannot carry out that service without implementing distancing, is probably quite a good touchstone for that.
Right. Thank you, Lucy. And from Maxine from Families Achieving Balance, if a new employee is currently on a 3-month trial period and has made it clear they are not going to vaccinate, however, the role requires it but is not mandated, would it be appropriate to end the employment based on suitability for the position having changed during the trial period?
Yeah, that's a good question. I believe the answer to that is yes, but I will double check with my supervising partner and send an email to you, Kathy, to circulate just to clarify that answer. I believe the answer is yes, because you don't have to give reasons for dismissal when you dismiss under a trial period. it's obviously best practice to give reasons so that the person isn't completely blindsided and tries to kick up a stink about it. But yeah, I'll double check that one.
Great, thanks, Lucy. And actually, any follow-up we'll post on our website. Kathy will send it to participants. And thank you, Denise, who's just advised people 12 years and 3 months and older need to use Vaccine Pass, from what she's read.
3 months and older.
12 years and 3 months and older.
And 3 months. Yeah, I'm like I said, sorry, I'm not across that level of detail. But I believe that if you're eligible to be vaccinated, then you would have to have a vaccine pass, and if you weren't eligible to be vaccinated, then obviously you can't be vaccinated, so you're not going to have a vaccine pass. If it's 12 years, 3 months, then I'd imagine that's because of the lag time of being vaccinated, but yeah.
I think I've gone through the questions so far that are in the chat, and we still have some time, and it's just wonderful to have Lucy here to provide this guidance. Do people have other questions? If you don't do it through chat, you can just go off mute and ask.
Yes, I have a question. Rhonda Ritchie here from Sailability. We cannot social distance when we take our clients sailing. There are small boats and we sit side by side. If they're not double vaccinated and there may be conditions where there are children, what's the next best thing? I mean, are we safe just wearing masks?
So that would again come down to a health and safety risk assessment, and if there are children involved, then obviously there's kind of a heightened risk in that space because you're dealing with vulnerable people who can't be vaccinated. So yeah, that would really be an assessment and a judgment call as to whether masks are adequately dealing with that or mitigating that risk. And if you think yes, fine. If you think no, then you may have to move on to say, okay, well, everyone has to be vaccinated. So if we just consulted with the parents as to whether they felt mask wearing was adequate. I mean, our volunteers, we've asked them to be...
John, can you please mute? You are mute. Kathy, sorry. Are you able to mute? Make sure everyone's mute. So sorry, did we get to that point about sailability, from sailability?
Yes, we've asked all our volunteers to be double vaccinated if they're coming in close contact with the clients for more than 15 minutes at a time, which is what will happen. So I guess if we just consulted with the unvaccinated clients to see whether if they are prepared to wear a mask, and I guess check with our volunteers, are they prepared to sail with somebody who's not vaccinated?
Yeah.
Or does it come down to a personal choice for each of the volunteers?
Yeah, and the other thing to consider is that if you're coming into the close contact definition, then you're also going to have to comply with the COVID protection framework, which means that at certain levels, you won't be able to operate if people are not vaccinated. So that's another thing to consider, is that if you're not going down the route of requiring everyone to be vaccinated who can be, then you won't be able to operate in the stricter levels.
So will that be indicated in the traffic light guidelines?
If you go onto the government website, the Fight Against COVID-19 or whatever it is, there's a PDF, and it's a one-page PDF. It's got the traffic light colours down the side, and it's got quite clear bullet points as to what the restrictions are. So
lovely.
For close contact businesses, at orange, you have no limits if you use vaccine certificates. If you don't use vaccine certificates, then you can't operate at orange.
Okay.
So at green, if you don't use vaccine certificates, then the restriction is face coverings or 1 metre distancing. So, face coverings and 1 metre distancing. So if you can't distance by 1 metre, then you probably couldn't operate even at green. So you'd probably be looking at vaccines.
That's lovely. That'll be lovely. Thank you. Very helpful.
Right, thank you for that. Another question that's come through. Are counsellors considered health service workers and therefore must be vaccinated to do their jobs? They meet face-to-face and are within 2 metres of clients.
Yeah, that's a good question. I am not entirely sure of the answer to that one, but if you look up the COVID-19 vaccination order, in one of the schedules, I think it's Schedule 2, it lists all the people that are covered by the order. It's kind of clear as mud. There are some people that very obviously fall into those categories, and there are some people that it's kind of a little bit debatable.
Lucy? Sorry, can you... did you want to say something, Tony? Sorry.
Yes, I was just going to say, Lucy, that counsellors aren't on that list. It's not clear.
Yeah. So that's why I say I'm not entirely sure if they are or not, because I don't think it's quite clear whether they fit into it. So again, it would be a case of if they don't fall into it, then you'd come down to your health and safety risk assessment. If it's possible that they don't fall into it, then erring on the side of caution is possibly best, given the close quarters that they have to operate in. Although, at least with counselling, unlike sort of your GPs, where it's quite difficult to do things over the phone, much as they try, there are kind of alternative ways to carry out those services as well, Zoom and phone consults. So that may be something to consider as well.
I've just got something to add there. My understanding is that counsellors are, under this legislation, they are considered health workers. And so they are, our advice from our association, the New Zealand Association of Counsellors, is that counsellors are required are mandated under that legislation. And a lot of people have contracts with Ministry of Health organisations like ACC, which means that they're automatically under that as well. Yeah.
Lucy, did you have any comment? Thanks, Nara.
Yeah, I mean, like I say, I'm not entirely sure of the answer to that without checking again against the order. So I can't offer anything any more concrete than that.
Okay.
I have a question, Janet. So we are staff are all vaccinated. We will be working with unvaccinated clients. What if a staff member has a mask exemption and the clients are fine to be working with that counsellor without a mask, and a health check is done before any contact? Is that okay?
That's a good question. Again, it's kind of it's clear as mud, because you have the government saying you have to do that at these, and then of course they have all the mask exemptions, which people can download themselves without any other verification that they need an exemption. But I think again it would come down to a health and safety risk assessment, and once you've consulted with employees, if they're rather the clients and all employees, and if they're happy with that, then that may form part of the health and safety risk assessment. Because yes, it's very difficult when you have two sides of the coin. On one side it's very strict mask use, and the other side you've got, be kind to everyone who can't wear a mask. So but we may get more guidance in the coming weeks when we move to the protection framework, because given the restrictions are going to ease a bit, and there's got to be much more movement of people even when there's COVID in the community. It'll be interesting to see whether there's any crackdown on these exemptions and enforcement of mask wearing.
Thanks, Lucy, and thank you, Andrew Lilburn, who's offered some information about the councillors, that amendment to the COVID health response order. Councillors are required to be fully vaccinated, so the information's there for participants to look at. So thank you for that. Going back to some questions, I'm not sure whether this is a question or a statement you might want to clarify. Juanita, seems the new COVID legislation address the official exemptions within a vaccine passport, aka they will be covered under a passport.
Yeah, sorry, Liz. Yeah, so I mean, I don't have the details, but it seems like the official exemption for that medical criteria will be factored into that passport.
Yeah, so if you've been granted an exemption, you'll be able to get a vaccine passport like based on that exemption. But the exemptions are quite rare, as my understanding. They've got to be approved by the minister. So the GPs don't grant exemptions. They are kind of a vetting level, a veto level, and then it goes to the minister to decide whether the person gets an exemption or not. So, and my understanding, the criteria for that's very limited. It's things like people who are allergic to components of the vaccine. That's kind of the main criteria for exemption. Things like being immunocompromised, to my understanding, is not a criteria for exemption. In fact, they're being encouraged to get the vaccine. So unless there was a specific thing to, a specific medical issue with a specific immunocompromised person that led to that exemption, even that's not a high enough threshold.
I understand the exemptions are temporary too, 6 months.
Oh, I'm not sure about timelines, sorry. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, at the previous Zoom I went to, I think they mentioned that. From John Charles, I'm not absolutely sure about this. Are there any special rules for people with multiple jobs, example, if they are exposed? I know, John, you might want to flesh that out a little.
Well, I'm just, this is John here. I'm just thinking of many sort of hospital, perhaps not so much hospital staff, because they all have to be double vaccinated, but there are sort of lots of casual positions going from one employer to another. And for example, if they become a close contact or something like that, what are their obligations to their other employer? Is there anything specific?
So again, it would come down to a health and safety risk assessment for different employers, factoring in the fact that these people will be going to different workplaces. Whether or not those workplaces would heighten the risk in terms of that assessment would kind of depend on whether the risk at the other jobs gave the person a higher risk of exposure than being in the community, which is going to be a touchstone of these health and safety risk assessments, because if the risk at work is no higher than the risk in the community, you're going to be hard pressed to justify requiring the role to be vaccinated. In terms of if they become a close contact, well, that will depend on government guidance and having to self-isolate. And if the person's having to self-isolate, then you'll just have to follow normal employment processes. If they're not able to work, then they obviously can't come to work, and the employer will have to work out cover for them.
Thanks, Lucy. Another question from Tessa: is there anything in the legislation to protect the employees who are choosing not to be vaccinated? i.e., does the current legislation override the Bill of Rights about medical freedom to choose, given that as the social sector we have always pushed against discrimination and supported tino rangatiratanga?
Yeah, so there's nothing in the legislation, to my knowledge, that kind of goes into any great detail about alternative options, but just from a standard health and safety process, PPE, mask wearing, hygiene, distancing, all of those public health tools are the only things you can really use if someone's not vaccinated. But in terms of the discrimination point, the orders have been, well, at least the actual legislative orders, so your healthcare workers, your border workers, your education, all of those ones, that order has been challenged 2 or 3 times in the High Court, and the High Court has found that the orders are justified limits. So the Bill of Rights is not a be-all, end-all. I think it's Section 5 says that justified limits are acceptable if they can be justified in a free and democratic society. So the High Court has upheld the order as being justified limits. So unless and until a higher court overturns that judgment, then it's not discriminatory. Or it's not a breach of the Bill of Rights is rather what I should say. Yeah.
So just maybe the final question from Sarah Wolfe. We run community pottery classes where the tutors and students are in close contact for extended periods of time. While it is clear how vaccine certificates could work for the adults, with children under 12, we can't. This is complicated when children are coming from households with unvaccinated households, potentially exposing other children. Are there any guidelines around this? For example, are we able to only accept children from households with vaccinated adults and older children?
It's not entirely clear about how that applies to, because children themselves don't have to be vaccinated. But again, I know I've said this a number of times, but it would come down to a health and safety risk assessment and how you would manage the various risks. I imagine in that circumstance, you would be able to kind of distance people across the room. So your distancing, your mask wearing, if you did an assessment and thought that that would sufficiently mitigate the risk of having those children present, then that would be fine, I would have thought. But it will come down to your health and safety risk assessment. And I mean, if you think about the analogy to schools, there are going to be children going to schools who, all the children in the school can't be vaccinated, and they'll be going to coming from families where potentially there are unvaccinated adult members of the household. So, if you kind of make an analogy to that within the COVID protection framework and align that with your health and safety risk assessment, then it's unfortunately a lot of this is grey area.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Lucy. You've, I think, been incredibly helpful in providing what guidance you're able, given the legislation and where everything sits. I'm just thinking we're got still a little bit of time, unless there's any other burning questions. There's just a couple of things I know Tess has sort of raised, and maybe this is a subject of another Zoom, about the willingness of organisations to push the government for supply of rapid antigen test kits as an interim compromise for those not getting the vaccination. So I don't know people's thoughts on that. I think, again, that's probably could involve quite a lot of korero that we need to have. Also, this isn't related to this particular session, but Ros Rice, from who's the Executive Officer of Community Networks Aotearoa, has just come from a Zoom with an MP and have news about funding, which will be announced later today by Jacinda, and has offered to share that. And I'm guessing people will be interested in hearing about that. So are you there, Ros?
Yep, I'm here. Yes, we had a Zoom just before we came here, and it was a heads up about what was going to be announced, and I sort of thought you might be interested. the conversation moved from the fact that government is moving from the idea of elimination to us all living with COVID. So my heart sunk really, but that's been obvious. But anyway, the issue is that Cabinet on Monday gave MSD permission to stand for the welfare piece of work. And the MSD infrastructure is looking into see what they can do as far as welfare support across New Zealand. Previously, most support has been aimed towards health providers. Now they're looking broader. They are looking to work more closely with locally led delivery and support organisations, and they're looking at regional coordination, and they want to work in partnership with social welfare organisations, basically working within communities. And with this movement into MSD taking a bigger part, flows a resource package of $200 million, which they're going to focus towards existing infrastructure who provide service in the welfare side of things. So that's going to be announced this afternoon, and I thought you might just like to have a heads up about that coming through.
Fantastic, thanks so much, Ros. That's very interesting. Look forward to hearing the press release. I'm just aware some more questions have come through. We'll see if we can get through a couple of them at least. Tony, read the risk assessment. The Worksafe website has a set of 7 questions to ask to guide you in terms of risk. There is no scoring system at all. We've put numbers on this to assess risk to our employees/counsellors. Do you have any guidance on what constitutes high risk, over 50% score? High risk implies that vaccinations are required. To me, the Worksafe risk assessment is very general and a weak tool. Any comments, Lucy?
Yeah, you're not wrong. It is very high level, and it's also missing some. It's obviously very focused on health and safety, but it completely misses the point of continuity and disruption to businesses as well. So that's not a health and safety risk assessment, but it's, in our view, quite an important consideration because you don't want your entire workforce to go down. So yeah. Putting numbers on your risk is probably quite a good analytical thing to do in terms of trying to work out where that line is between what makes it high risk and low risk. Kind of come back to the touchstone point is the risk elevated when compared to not being at work or not being in that role? And as COVID circulates more in the community, that may kind of change the risk assessment, because at the moment, obviously, there's not a heck of a lot of it around, but eventually, you know, as we start to learn to live with COVID, it will be around. So is that risk elevated when compared to just being in the community in general? And if it is, then you're obviously going to be on the higher side of the risk assessment than the lower side.
Great, thank you, Lucy. Final question, and I actually wonder whether this should be a future Zoom topic from Tessa. What is the advice from managers here in terms of contingency planning for the loss of highly experienced specialised professionals, social workers, senior medical practitioners, etc.? Did you have any comment, Lucy? Probably not really your area.
Yeah, it's probably quite individualised as well between different sectors.
I think that actually we could potentially do a Zoom on that for the social sector, because certainly there are a lot of organisations who have been impacted by that, and I think it might be good for managers to be able to share how they're all addressing this and learn from each other. So thanks for that, Tessa. Before we close off, also just to flag that SociaLink is offering de-escalation training. We're sort of figuring that with all the requirements some organisations are going to have in terms of asking people for vaccine passports, that potentially could get quite tricky for those who don't, who don't have the passport. So we're offering that training. So please go to our website and about when that training is, if you think that would be of interest to you. It is free. Right, Lucy, you need to go at 11 sharp. So Look, thank you so much, Lucy, for your insight, and thank you everyone for your fantastic questions. I really hope that has given you the guidance you've needed as much as possible within with what we're working with at the moment. So lots of thank yous, that's great. So I'll just finish off with a karakia, and like I said, we may be holding another Zooey on that topic about how organisations are coping with losing staff. So thank you again. So karakia, kua mutu a mātou mahi mō tēnei wā, manakitea mai mātou katoa, o mātou hoa, o mātou whānau, ai au ki te aurangi. Kia ora. Thank you so much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. And thank you so much, Lucy. It's been invaluable.
Pleasure.
Okay. Not 10:59. We did it.
Great.
Well done.
Kia ora. Thank you.